In the previous episode, we introduced adaptive financial architecture. We established that resilient households operate through cash flow from living, cash flow from investing, and cash flow from financing. In this video, we begin benchmarking the first and most important system, cash flow from living. Because before a household can invest, compound wealth, expand optionality, or construct future freedom, it must first generate recurring operational surplus. This is foundational because recurring surplus is what creates liquidity, adaptability, resilience, and strategic flexibility. Without recurring surplus, the system eventually becomes dependent on debt, asset liquidation, or stable external conditions, and dependence creates fragility. Cash flow from living represents the operational performance of the household. This includes recurring income, recurring lifestyle expenses, contribution margin, and recurring surplus generation. Conceptually, this functions similarly to operating cash flow in corporate finance. It answers a critically important question. Does the household generate enough recurring surplus to remain adaptive? This is why recurring surplus matters so much, because recurring surplus becomes liquidity accumulation, emergency reserves, investing capacity, debt reduction capacity, and future optionality. Strong systems generate surplus consistently. Fragile systems consume nearly everything they produce. To benchmark operational strength properly, we need to revisit contribution margin analysis. The household structure begins with recurring income. Then we subtract variable lifestyle costs. Examples include portions of groceries, fuel, discretionary entertainment, dining, travel, and variable utilities. Basically anything that in an emergency you could cut to zero, that's why I said a portion of groceries or a portion of fuel, that becomes variable. And when we subtract these variable expenses to basically, when we subtract them from our income, this creates what's called contribution margin. So the contribution margin is our income minus our variable expenses. Contribution margin represents the proportion of recurring income available to support fixed obligations, investing, liquidity accumulation, and future flexibility. Then we subtract our fixed lifestyle obligations. Examples include basically anything that is fixed that is very difficult to remove. So, for instance, groceries, there's going to be a rock bottom level of groceries that you cannot spend less than. There's going to be some sort of a utilities fixed component that you cannot remove less than that. There's going to be insurance for whether it's your car or whether it's for your home. There's going to be recurring service contracts. There may be insurance as a result of a separation that legally has to stay in place so that in the event of your death, you have money that goes to the support of children. Regardless, you have to subtract all of these fixed lifestyle obligations. And the remaining amount becomes recurring operational surplus. This surplus is the stabilizing force of the entire system. One of the most important benchmarks in adaptive financial architecture is recurring surplus ratio. This measures how much recurring operational flexibility the household generates relative to income. Strong systems maintain meaningful operating surplus, margin for uncertainty, and recurring flexibility. Fragile systems often operate with minimal surplus, thin liquidity, and dependency on stable conditions. This creates a major structural problem because even small disruptions, inflation, unexpected expenses, reduced hours, or income volatility can rapidly destabilize systems operating with extremely thin recurring surplus. This is why resilient systems intentionally preserve margin for error. So just so that we're on the same page, the recurring surplus ratio is measured by the income minus your variable expenses related to lifestyle, minus your fixed expenses related to lifestyle. And that recurring surplus, or that surplus, hopefully, is divided by income to get the recurring surplus ratio. At this point, it's important to clarify the role of the contribution income statement within adaptive financial architecture. The contribution income statement is not replacing the traditional cash flow statement. Instead, it functioned as the planning and structural analysis engine. This is where we analyze variable lifestyle costs, fixed obligations, contribution margin, recurring surplus, and structural adaptability. The purpose of the contribution income statement is to answer questions like how rigid is the household structure, how sensitive is the system to income volatility, how much recurring surplus is being generated operationally, and how much flexibility does the structure preserve. This becomes the managerial planning layer of the household operating system. Within the contribution income statement, one of the most important benchmarks becomes the recurring surplus ratio. We define it as recurring surplus ratio is equal to net income before financing charges divided by income. This is extremely important conceptually because financing charges, mortgages, loan interests, and financing structures, and when I say mortgages, I mean the interest portion of the mortgage, represent financing consequences rather than operational living performance. This distinction matters. The recurring surplus ratio therefore measures how efficiently the household converts recurring income into operational flexibility before financing pressure is considered. Higher recurring surplus ratios generally indicate stronger operational adaptability, greater margin for uncertainty, stronger liquidity generation capacity, and higher future optionality. Thin recurring surplus ratios indicate structural rigidity, weak margin for error, and elevated fragility under uncertainty. Once the contribution income statement establishes the structure of the system, the results begin appearing within the cash flow statement. This is where the framework becomes very powerful. The contribution income statement explains why the system behaves the way it does. The cash flow statement records the liquidity consequences of that structure. As recurring surplus ratios improve, the household typically experiences stronger cash flow from living, improving liquidity accumulation, expanding emergency reserves, greater investing capacity, and increasing adaptability. This is critical because operational planning eventually becomes cash flow reality. Strong recurring surplus generation leads to positive operating cash flows, stronger liquidity buffers, and expanding future flexibility. Weak recurring surplus generation eventually creates thin operating cash flows, liquidity stress, financing dependency, and reduced optionality. Importantly, the cash flow statement itself remains a traditional indirect method cash flow statement, meaning we still begin with net income, then adjust for non-cash charges, the equivalent of working capital charges or changes in our accruals and our prepaids, investing activities, and financing activities. This preserves accounting integrity, traditional financial statement linkage, and consistency with financial reporting frameworks. The contribution income statement, therefore, does not replace the cash flow statement. Instead, it acts as the structural planning layer that influences the future operating cash flows ultimately recorded on the cash flow statement. This creates a very clean separation. The contribution income statement analyzes structural adaptability. The cash flow statement records liquidity outcomes. This distinction is critically important because not all financial stress originates from low income or unexpected shocks. Often, financial fragility originates from weak, recurring surplus generation. And weak recurring surplus generation is usually caused by excessive fixed obligations, recurring lifestyle expansion, thin contribution margins, and structurally rigid operating systems. The contribution income statement helps diagnose the source of the fragility. The cash flow statement then records the liquidity consequences over time. This creates a much more complete framework for understanding resilience, adaptability, liquidity, and future optionality. Because ultimately, strong cash flow from living begins with strong operational structure. In this episode, we established a critically important idea. The contribution structure drives the cash flow outcome. The contribution income statement becomes the planning engine. It explains structural rigidity, recurring surplus generation, adaptability, and resilience. The cash flow statement then records the liquidity consequences of that structure over time. Strong recurring surplus generation improves cash flow from living, liquidity accumulation, emergency runway, investing capacity, and future optionality. This is why structure matters so much, because financial statements do not create outcomes. They record the consequences of the underlying system. And resilient systems are not built accidentally. They are designed intentionally, benchmarked carefully, and optimized structurally over time. In the next episode, we move deeper into cash flow from investing. We'll examine future state goal engineering, strategic underinvestment, productive capital allocation, and how adaptive systems intentionally convert recurring surplus into future freedom. Because eventually, the purpose of resilience is not merely stability. It is expansion, adaptability, and the ability to intentionally shape the future.